Okay. Thanks everyone for coming today. This is the second event of the Motor Learning Hub. The goal is to bring together different people that are working on motor learning from a range of different perspectives, and have talks and workshops and other events. At the end, I'll put up a slide also with a chance for you to tell me about yourself and what you're interested in. If you didn't fill it out after the last meeting, you're welcome this time. Our last speaker was Professor Daniel Wolpert. If you didn't catch the talk, it's available on the university YouTube page. I can send the link if you can't find it. And today we're pleased to introduce Professor Rajiv Ranganathan, who's going to give the talk today. He did his undergraduate degree in the University of Madras in India, and followed by a master's at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and a PhD at Penn State University. And so I met Rajiv while I was doing his PhD at Penn State, while I was doing my postdoc there. I think it was probably the golden age of motor control at Penn State University. There was a huge number of researchers and an endless number of graduate students and postdocs studying motor control. So it was really a great time to be there. And we had lots of interesting interactions between each other, and a very lively meetings, the Action Club there. And in the spirit of the Action Club, where the spirit of the Action Club was, we would let people talk for 15 minutes, and then after that, it was free to ask questions. So Rajiv said he's happy for you to interrupt him in the middle and ask him questions as he goes along. So after his PhD, he was at the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago and Northwestern University. And in 2014, he started at Michigan State University, where he's in the departments of Kinesiology and Mechanical Engineering. I think this is an interesting combination of fields, which definitely contributes to his research on topics of motor learning and motor control, looking at variability, rehabilitation, human-machine interface. And I read Rajiv's paper on this topic, which he published recently on model task paradigms for motor learning. It's something which I've thought about before, and it seems something that's definitely missing and problematic in the field. So I asked Rajiv to come, and he kindly agreed to give us his talk. So thanks, Rajiv. Interested to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Jason, for the kind introduction and for inviting me. Again, I'm hoping all of you are doing well and staying safe. I know these are sort of weird times, but I think I'm happy that I could at least meet all of you virtually. So, I mean, I've got my email address, and if you're a Twitter user, you can also contact me over Twitter. I'm happy to answer questions after today's talk as well. So maybe before I start my talk, I'll say this is sort of a little different from the usual talk, which focus a lot on experiments and so on. So it's a point of view. So I want everybody to know that it's subjective by definition, because this is something that we as a group have worked on in terms of the authors on the study. So it's our point of view. And I think the other thing to also maybe emphasize is I'm not taking a sort of moral superiority stance or anything like that. A lot of the problems that I will point out sort of equally apply to my own studies as well. So it's more meant as a way of sort of critically examining what we are doing as a field, and not necessarily meant at sort of pointing fingers at anybody. So with that out of the way, I'll come to the main topic, which is really this idea that motor learning, if you look at motor learning studies, or you've been in motor learning for any amount of time, you know that people have very, very unique paradigms in terms of trying to address the issue of motor learning. So I picked out a few here. So you've got on the left here, in terms of sequence learning, you've got the finger pressing, key pressing types of tasks. You've got another type of sequence learning here, which involves a force transducer and isometric force production. So it's not really moving fingers, but sort of producing different forces. You've got Sandro Musaivaldi's body-machine interface, where you're moving your fingers, trying to get a cursor to different points of the screen, something that I've also worked on for a little bit. You've got Yodelio's and Carl Newell's rollerball task, which is a coordination task where you have to learn sort of, a particular relative phase between your wrist motions to get the ball rolling and keep it in motion. You've got target tracking tasks where, you're given a target on a screen and asked to match it. So this is work from Chandramouli Krishnan, looking at, matching an ankle trajectory during gait. You've got variability tasks where your goal is sort of like similar to a dart throw, get to the same point again and again. So this is from Dagmar Stornad's group, what they call the Skittles task, where you're throwing a ball towards the target virtually. And then you've got sort of the adaptation task. So two of the most popular paradigms in adaptation are visual motor adaptation. So you've got something where you're moving a cursor and you try to dissociate the visual information from the proprioceptive information by introducing a rotation angle, or in the lower limb you do it with split belts and have the different feet move at different speeds. So again, a lot of different paradigms, and each address sort of a different aspect of learning. So the whole idea for this paper sort of came from a graduate seminar course we did a couple of years ago, where we read, like usual, a couple of papers a week for about 10 or 12 weeks. And at the end, we noticed that at the end of 12 weeks, we hadn't found a single paper that repeated another task, right? Everybody sort of had, every paper had this unique paradigm. And so we wanted to see, is this a problem in motor learning, right? And what some people call a toothbrush problem, right? This phrase was used for describing theories in psychology. And the main idea is, like a toothbrush, everybody has one, but nobody uses anybody else's, right? So that's sort of the idea. And we wanted to see if this is true in motor learning in terms of how experimental paradigms are constructed. And so what we did was we looked at a 2-year period in 5 of the most popular journals for publishing motor learning. And we extracted about 64 studies. So, fair bit. And we kind of, inclusion criteria, we use things like, it had to show learning. So, there has to be some change with practice. We focused on sort of the between subject design. So this sort of, which is the more popular design in motor learning. So you have group A learn something and group B learn something else. We excluded the within subject designs. And then we focused on studies that used unimpaired adults. And the rationale being here that if you're using children or if you're using individuals with movement impairments, the task usually has to be modified in some way. So we thought, that might sort of exaggerate the amount of fragmentation. So we focused on, adults where, you can pretty much give them any task and usually they can do it. And what we did sort of based on that first slide is we defined sort of different learning categories or task categories that reflected different types of learning. So this sort of categorization has been proposed by other individuals in the field, but usually it's sort of dichotomous, right? So there's like skill learning and adaptation, or you've got scaling tasks versus coordination tasks. So there's precedent for this before, but we just didn't want to be caught in a sort of just 2 bins. So we made 6 bins instead. And so the categories here are shown below. So you've got adaptation tasks, which are basically, like I said, responding to perturbations of typically well-learned movement. So visual motor adaptation, force field adaptation, split pedal adaptation, and so on. We used an applied category if the task was just something very specific to a particular domain. So, if somebody was practicing learning of juggling, for example, and they were really interested in juggling, then that sort of is an applied task. We looked at coordination, where it's some kind of spatiotemporal pattern involving usually more than a single degree of freedom. So this could be bimanual coordination studies typically fit this paradigm. We've got sequence learning, which is again some movement sequence that you're trying to produce. We've got tracking tasks, where again you've got some thing that is time varying and you're trying to match that paradigm either with forces or with kinematics. And then we used a variability category for repeated performance. So again, think of the dartboard example. Your goal is to kind of hit the bullseye again and again. That would be an example of a variability category. So we took all these 64 studies, divided them up into these categories. And then what we did within each category is we looked at the parameters of each task, right? So we looked at each study and sort of extracted some parameters. And the examples of parameters are, if you're, say, using visual motor adaptation tasks, we would use things like, how far the targets are placed, how many targets are placed, what's the visual motor rotation angle you're using, and so on. If you're using a sequence learning task, this could be, how many elements in the sequence, are you using your fingers to do it, or using, say, a force transducer, etc. So we kind of coded some parameters for these tasks to check whether two tasks could be classified as being, the same or not. And it's important to say that we didn't look at things like number of trials, for example. We just wanted to see if they did the same task. I think it would be pretty difficult for things to match on all categories. So we excluded things like practice time, those kinds of parameters, just focusing on the task itself. And so we consider a task as being unique if it didn't match any other task in its category. So here's the main finding. So this pie chart on the left shows you the rough distribution across the categories. So we got a fair number from each of these categories. But as you can see here, the graph between the number of studies and the number of unique tasks almost is a perfect straight line, which means that every task was unique. Every study had pretty much a unique task except for 2 studies. So out of the 64, 62 were unique. And if you're wondering what's special about those 2 that didn't match, one of them was from the same author, right? So it's probably like a lab thing where they did the same task again and again. So it matched. So again, not very promising in terms of conformity between labs, but at least the same lab used the same task. And the other one was on a commercial device where you could only do one kind of thing. So that was the other thing that matched. So literally, when you could say this is as close to 100% as it would get, everybody or every study that we reviewed had a different paradigm. And this held across categories. So there was no difference between whether it was adaptation or sequence learning or coordination. So it's sort of, it's prevalent in all these categories. So the first time we looked at this result, we thought, well, maybe this is just a consequence of people studying different things. I mean, people are interested in different questions, as explored in the first slide. They all don't really study the same thing. So maybe they're just choosing different tasks that address specific questions within each category. So to see if, to make a stronger test of the fragmentation idea, what we did was we looked now at, over a 5-year period, we looked at about 20 studies that used all the same, seemingly the same task. And we chose golf putting because it was popular both in motor learning, but also in psychology and sometimes even in some robotics work as well. So we thought, we'll review studies where people have essentially boiled down to the same task and see if, how similar they are in terms of, again, these parameters that we extract. And again, maybe to cut a long story short, the fragmentation story still holds, right? So here's a quick example. If you look at things like putting distance, if you look at the type of the target, whether it's an actual hole or whether it's just a point on the screen, what surface they were playing in, everything seems to vary, right? So there's no standardization across all these studies, even though ostensibly they're all doing the same task, right? There's no reason potentially to introduce these variations across these studies. The other thing that we also found are performance measures. So what were the dependent variables? Again, varied a lot, even though the task was essentially the same. So some measured, say, the distance from the ball to the target. Some had a points system. So, they'd have like circles and then say, okay, if it landed in the center, it was 100 points. And if it landed here, it was 20 points and so on. So what they reported essentially was the number of points. And some of them just looked at the number of putts you make, right? So total sort of count. So it's okay, you make 40% of your putts or whatever. So again, this goes to show that even when people are using the same task, there is a wide range of variation in how those tasks are implemented. So the second argument is, well, okay, yes, these differences exist, but these differences are trivial. They're not going to matter in any way when we're addressing motor learning questions. And to that, I think there are two responses. I think, and at the very least, there's evidence that parameters do affect the results, at least in terms of the magnitudes, right? So here's an example on the top from Bond and Taylor in a visual motor rotation task, looking at the amount of explicit and implicit learning as a function of the amount of visual motor rotation. So if you introduce a 15-degree rotation versus 30-degree rotation and so on, and you see there is a big difference in terms of the amount of explicit and implicit learning, right? So the bigger amplitude rotations have a lot more explicit learning compared to the smaller rotation. So again, at least in terms of a magnitude, it does make a difference if somebody used, say, 30 degrees versus 15 degrees versus 45 degrees and so on. But at least there are some examples, in addition to this, where the conclusions themselves may be altered by these variations in the parameters. So one such example was from Overdoen and colleagues, where they found, again, I don't want to go into the whole detail, but they found that the consolidation for force field learning depended on whether there were catch trials in the data or not. So again, if you're sort of not familiar with all this, catch trials are usually introduced in motor learning to occasionally probe learning. Right? They're not designed to alter the learning in any way. They're just sort of measurement probes, if you will. And what this group showed, as you can see on the graph down here, is, again, all that's different between the solid line and the dashed line are whether you have catch trials or not. So some people have no catch trials, 0%, and then this group has 20% of the trials are catch trials. You see that the initial learning is just looks the same, but when you look at the consolidation, so if you practice an interfering force field and then come back, there seems to be a big difference in the retention of the memory, right? So one group looks exactly like where it started off. So 0% shows no consolidation whatsoever, whereas the 20% catch trials shows a significant retention when they come back. So again, even these, and I want to sort of just point this language from their abstract, and it says a seemingly insignificant and inconsistently applied methodological detail may reconcile this discrepancy. So again, there were some studies that found consolidation, some studies that didn't, and this study basically said, well, this might be one reason why. So it's not just, again, these differences may be trivial, but we can't take that for granted. So now I want to talk about a little bit of, so what, right? Okay, so there's fragmentation, what's the problem? And so there are both theoretical and methodological consequences. From a theoretical standpoint, basically every finding becomes an island, right? So there's no way, if everybody's using a different tasks, there is really no way to compare one study to another study directly, right? So all we can do are compare patterns. And this is what, our motor learning is very common, is this idea of what are called conceptual replications. So if I've got some idea, say, let's take variability as an example. If I say, okay, practicing with variability leads to better learning than practicing without variability. If somebody found that result in a task and I wanted to do it in my task, I would conceptually test it, right? So I would still use my task. I won't use their task. I would use my task and say, does this also work in my task? Now, some people think that is better because you're sort of generalizing the finding to more than one task. But other people have pointed out that this is actually a confirmation bias because you can never challenge the original finding. So think about the experiment that was there on the previous slide with the consolidation. Let's say you repeated that experiment and you found that in a different task, the catch trials, you wanted to see if the catch trials affect consolidation, right? And let's say if you get the same result, well, you say, yes, great, it also works in my thing, so the catch trials must be a really important thing. But think about what happens if your results don't match, right? So then you would not question the original finding, but rather you would say, well, it didn't work in sequence learning or it worked in adaptation, right? So you would change, you would attribute the failure to find that result directly to your task, right? Which is a problem because, again, in either of those alternatives, you're not challenging the original finding at all. That original finding still continues to persist. And specifically, if you think about in motor learning, we know that the task has an effect, right? And again, from going back to that first slide, there are different processes that operate in motor learning. We're not going to lump them all into one thing. And so the task does play a role, but if we attribute sort of all the variance to the task, then we truly don't understand what the task is actually doing. If you think about it in terms of methodological consequences, what it leads to, what fragmentation leads to, are a lot of arbitrariness in terms of different aspects of the study. And I'll get to this in a moment, but you can think about it in at least 3 terms. You've got arbitrariness in terms of how you select parameters for your experiment, arbitrariness in sample sizes, and most importantly, things like where the magnitude of effects make very little difference to your actual conclusion. So I'll take this one by one. So what do I mean by arbitrariness and task parameters? Basically, the idea here is, motor learning is based on human behavior, and that usually means that any sort of variable you're testing the effect of learning most likely has some sort of non-monotonic relation, right? So if you, again, think about, say, variability as an example, a small amount of variability may lead to better learning, but if you just keep on increasing the variability more and more, there's going to be at some point where that benefit you're seeing in learning goes down. You can do the same thing with other things where people have actually shown this. For example, feedback, how frequently you give the feedback, right? If you give feedback, if you don't give feedback at all, it's very hard to improve. But if you give feedback, after every trial or whatever, then people get dependent on the feedback. So again, you've got non-monotonic relations with respect to your task parameter. So when you have a non-monotonic relation like this, it becomes really important where you set your groups, right? So again, if you're doing a typical 2-group design, which is very common in motor learning studies, then you're selecting 2 points on this curve, but because you're using your own task and you really can't rely on anybody else's data, you're choosing these 2 parameters rather arbitrarily, right? And so you see where the problem is if you choose it arbitrarily. So again, if I think of this dot as my constant group and this dot as my variable group, if I happen to select them sort of at this parameter range, I'm going to get the variable group to be better than my constant group. If I select them so that they are here, well, I'm not going to get any difference between the constant and the variable group. And then if I select them so that they are here, my constant group is going to be better than my variable group. So you see that even though the underlying relation is the same, where you select the parameters makes a huge difference in terms of your interpretation of what variability is doing. And so to solve this, what you really need is you need the full dose response curve, right? 2-group designs are not going to solve it. And you need sort of, again, full variation of parameters to see what its effects are. But these are very difficult studies to do if everybody is choosing their own task, right? If everybody has to sort of establish their dose response curve, this is going to be an enormous amount of effort to do. The second point I want to make is arbitrariness in sample sizes. So again, when we went into these studies, we extracted the sample size as well. And this is a histogram of the average sample size per group across studies. And you see that, once you get past 20 per group, there's like, maybe 4 studies in there that are over that limit. So a wide number of studies in here are only about 12 to 16 participants a group, right? And to sort of put this in context, this would be equivalent to being able to detect an effect size of a coincidence of 1, which is, again, very large effect size, right? So it could be that some motor learning manipulations are strong, But if we're sort of aiming at Cohen's d of 1, then it's almost like every manipulation we're making has a huge effect on the learning. So what we think is happening is, in general, this is sort of more a tradition in the field rather than something that we are actually, doing sample size calculations on. And part of the reasons why we're sort of relying on this thumb rule is because we don't have good, estimates of effect sizes for these kinds of experiments, right? So we could rely on previous data, but previous data is again based on smaller sample sizes, so it's going to be biased. And so unless we have a large corpus of data, our effect sizes are either going to be biased or we're going to be relying on this sort of heuristics. We think 12 per group is enough or 20 per group is enough, and not really sort of focusing on why we're making those choices. And then the last part I want to say is, if you look at motor learning studies, and you look at the discussion, 9 times out of 10, there is almost no discussion of the magnitude of the effect, right? You'll get things that rely on the group differences, right? Whatever, group A did group better than group B, and so this is the conclusion. But there's usually almost no discussion of how much group A did better than group B, right? So we don't care how much because, again, everybody has their own paradigm. So, talking about it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because, it may not translate to somebody else's. And so effectively what we're doing is we're throwing away the magnitude of the effect. So if you look at this curve here, you have group A versus group B. For most studies, if now group B did that, the discussion section would pretty much be unchanged, right? Because all that matters is group A did better than group B. And so people write their conclusions. And so, this, if you think about it, take a step backwards, this is kind of not a really good sign for motor learning, which is, again, sort of closely tied to an applied field where we're either trying to improve skill or whether we're trying to improve rehab. The magnitude of the effect matters, right? So if I'm I'm a stroke survivor and I want to improve my walking speed, the amount by which I want to improve surely makes a difference in the choice of which motor learning paradigm I'm going to choose or which rehabilitation paradigm I'm going to choose. But again, current motor learning studies almost never talk about the magnitudes of these effects. Again, primarily because people think it's unique to their paradigm, so it's not really worth talking about. This also leads to the other problem that we can't really compare different types of interventions, right? So there's, say, there's mental practice and there's variable practice and there's robotic training, all these different ways that people have focused on to improve motor learning. But we really can't put them on the same scale, right? I can't compare, is mental practice really better than robotic training, or is robotic training really better than just, say, one more practice session without robots? We can't really make those things because, again, everybody's using their own tasks, which makes this sorts of questions, which are important questions, by the way, very difficult to answer. So what do we do? And I think hopefully the fragmentation issue and the problems associated with fragmentation mean that one solution is we develop standardized paradigms that can be done across many labs, right? And again, this is not unique to motor learning. People who are using, say, model organisms in biology or neuroscience already do this, right? So if you have a model organism, so C. elegans, then everybody works on that particular model organism, right? People don't randomly choose whatever thing they want to study. There are certain model organisms for studying certain processes. And I think we can also potentially adopt a similar thing where there are different model task paradigms for different types of questions. And so if you think about what might be important when we're addressing these model paradigms, we think there's at least 2 dimensions that are important. One is a relevance dimension, where relevance here refers to sort of our experimental hat on. We're saying, how cleanly does this address a research question? Right, that's what I mean by relevance here. And then for the other dimension that's important is replication, right? How easy or difficult is it to replicate in another lab? And so if you think about this sort of two dimensions, I think of our fragmented lab task as being down here, so very high on relevance. So they address very specific aspects of motor learning, but they're not replicated across labs, so very low on replication. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got sort of real world tasks, say, whatever, learning football or learning basketball, right? Lots of people do it, and we can easily replicate it across the many gyms and activity things that are out there, right? So there's very high on replication, but it's very low on relevance, right? You don't really know what process of motor learning you're isolating when you take something that's very complex and has a lot of sort of sub-motor skills in it. And so I think of model task as sort of the best of these worlds, right? It has the high relevance of the lab task, but it's also easily replicated across different laboratories. And again, the goal here is to think about it as not necessarily one paradigm for all of motor learning, but thinking about, say, one per category, right? So if you think about, say, sequence learning, then we have one model task for sequence learning, or if it's adaptation, we have one model task for adaptation, and so on. Or not necessarily even one, but say at least a few, right? So the idea is to go from very high fragmentation to a lower level of fragmentation. So this is sort of, the reviewers thought we should put in a roadmap for how this would be accomplished. So we came up with one. And the idea again here is at each step, we think about certain questions about how you develop a model paradigm. And so the first thing is we have a candidate task, right? We don't start with saying, I have a model task. We start with a candidate task. And the goal is the community decides whether it's a model task. So it's almost like a democratic process, right? So we start with a candidate task and we examine the degree of relevance, right? So relevance here, again, refers to the, how cleanly does your paradigm capture the core construct of learning that you're interested in? And also importantly, is this sort of generalizable to other tasks in that particular category? So if I'm, again, choosing something for variability, is it likely to also generalize to other tasks which require control of variability? The second one is how easy it is to replicate. So again, think about it in terms of the costs of equipment, costs of resources, space, etc. Software, you can do it open source so that another lab can just do it without having to develop their own version of it, and so on. So that would be what we would think of as replication. So the more easy it is to do, more easy it is to share, higher it is in terms of replication. And then the last one that's also important is, other than the task, we want to also think about the dependent variables, right? So what are we using to measure learning here? So again, one thing that, again, many of you in motor learning already know, even for this sort of, again, same kind of tasks, people use different dependent variables to assess learning. So one thing that could help is to have objective measurements for that particular model paradigm. You say, okay, for this task, this is the main dependent variable. And so if we sort of apply some thought to it, then that might be helpful in sort of replicating it across labs. So one of the key things here, for example, is the use of real world units, right? So not arbitrary point systems and so on, but if you're measuring error, then measure it in centimeters or in seconds, whatever it might be, so that that's easily comparable across different labs. So once we've designed the task and the dependent variables, the next thing we do is get into data collection. And so here, there's going to be a big investment upfront in terms of larger sample sizes than what we are typically used to in motor learning experiments. But again, I think my bias is, like, even if we oversample the first time, it's probably not a bad idea. So I think we could sort of lose on the efficiency aspect, but if we have a lot of data on one particular paradigm, then that gives us a good estimate for what kind of things happen with this task. And here's also other things like the dose response I talked about, right? So not simply sample one condition or two conditions, but sample across a broad range so that we understand the full dose response curve. And then finally, we want to look at measurement issues, right? So again, some questions in motor learning require some of these, some questions in motor learning don't require these. But things like, for example, how well is the motor learning retained, right? So if I come back the next day, am I better off than where I started off? There are some paradigms that do it better than others. So if you're thinking about those kinds of questions, retention might be important. For other paradigms, maybe it doesn't matter so much. Other things like, for example, inter-subject variability. So there are some paradigms where we want all subjects to sort of show consistent patterns, but if you're interested in, say, individual differences, then you want some variation between people. So all these kinds of things are important to quantify so that we can say, if I have model task A, then if I change this parameter, I get lots of intersubject variability. If I change this one, I don't get as much, and so on. So you can make, again, informed decisions about why we are choosing certain tasks when we are using them for experiments. And then finally, the most important thing is to share the data and the protocol, right? So that you're not only just sharing the results in terms of patterns, but actual numbers that, again, other people can use for making estimates of their own, right? So that's going to be the final big piece of this puzzle. This is some sort of big corpus of data that can be collected and shared across, across the world, essentially. And then the last step is, once you've done all this, right, so far you've only got a candidate, then the scientific community, the motor learning control community, makes a decision on whether, all the things that you've looked at seem to make sense. So the community says, well, yeah, this looks like a good task, or maybe they say, well, this really doesn't address this issue, because so far all the decisions you've made are your own. So then the community gets to weigh in on whether this would be a good model task. So that's how we at least envision this process going. So advantages of using the model tasks, they basically address all of the challenges that I laid out earlier in terms of doing direct replications, right? Not just conceptual ones. You've got good source for why you're selecting certain parameters, because you likely have full dose response curves. You can do sample size planning much better because you've got much better estimates of effect sizes. And because they are essentially the same task, you can compare magnitudes, right? So now I can compare a study that did mental practice versus a study that did robotic training and see how much better is one with respect to the other, right? Those kinds of comparisons are now possible. In addition, what I think it also affords is this large corpus of data on a few paradigms, allows for data-driven discovery, right? So currently, motor learning is sort of heavily on the hypothesis-driven side, right? Where investigators have to come up with a hypothesis, they test it through the experiment, and then they sort of repeat that cycle over and over again. But sometimes, if you have a hypothesis, you want to see if it at least fits something that's already out there, right? And so having the ability to do data-driven work could sort of facilitate some hypothesis that potentially people may not have thought about. And so that becomes possible with these sort of model paradigms. And I think last but not least, it serves as a big constraint to future theories of motor learning, right? So currently, if you look at most big papers on motor learning theories or frameworks, they often just rely on experiments that they do, right? Maybe, with the exception of maybe Fitts law that everybody tries to model. Most of the other experimental data that these models fit are experiments that they've collected in their own lab. So having, again, a big source of data on a particular paradigm makes it sort of a constraint in the sense that, any new theory or model that somebody comes up with has to fit this existing data to at least sort of pass the sniff test, right? So that at least it says, okay, I can fit the existing data. And so, potentially then they can add other experiments that sort of bring out the model even better. So what are the challenges, right? So of course, there are going to be challenges with doing something new. The first one, like I said, is going to be a much bigger initial effort. That's, again, not going to be on one lab, right? This is potentially that, a whole bunch of labs have to do it. So it's sort of like team science, which, again, in motor learning, we're not maybe as used to as, say, some other fields, but it requires a much bigger coordinated effort upfront. But the payoff is that subsequent effort is much better guided. Like I talked about, We don't have to make arbitrary decisions. Our efforts are much more guided because of this initial effort. There is a possibility of potential duplication, right? So one of the problems is if two people work on the same paradigm and they come up with the same question, there's a high likelihood that they're essentially going to do the same experiment. And again, part of this concern can be offset with sort of recent developments in the publishing world where, for example, now people can post preprints, not have to worry until the review process to see whether they've been scooped or not or whatever it might be. But there's also, for example, this idea of registered reports where you basically just give them the plan of what you're going to do, and then the journal accepts it and says, yes, once you collect the data, we will publish this if you follow what you say you did. And so this is really another potential way to sort of offset the concern that you're going to be running the same experiment as somebody else. There is also a concern that this may narrow the field only to these paradigms, right? So the sort of diversity of paradigms comes down drastically. And I think that is a concern that has often been raised in the model organism world, of biology, where people say, everybody's just studying, the worm or the mouse and nothing else. So I think it's definitely a concern that we have to address, but currently we are so far off the scale in terms of fragmentation that we have a pretty significant way to go before this becomes a big concern. And then finally, is this sort of infringing on freedom for individual experimenters? And here I'd like to say, again, this is not meant to be required or enforced for every experiment that you do. Sometimes, again, the goal here is really to reduce fragmentation, not necessarily sort of cut off everything else. So there may be some paradigms where the question can only be answered using some special software or special equipment. Nobody's, I think, arguing against that, or the goal is when you can do the same thing, let's do the same thing. So maybe to wrap up, just want to emphasize that, again, tasks in motor learning are highly fragmented. Everybody chooses their own thing. And so adopting model tasks may help this sort of cumulative progress of science, where really we can directly build off of somebody else's work without getting into that conceptual replication territory. You might ask this point, is this something new? And I'd say at least 30 years ago, somebody made almost exactly the same comment. This was a project in the late 1980s, and I put the quote here because I think it's pretty compelling. So it says, it was quite evident that the diversity of paradigms and theoretical approaches within which the phenomenon study made it very difficult to compare results across studies. And so this is one of these projects where they came up with a common task and had everybody work on the same task. And you could maybe argue that it's potentially getting worse since whatever 1990, because now everybody can build their own hardware. Everybody can sort of use MATLAB or Python to run their own experimental things. So it's probably getting worse because experimenters now have much more tools at their disposal than before. So if anything, like I said, it's worse than what the original phenomena was 30 years ago. And then if you get sort of more into the philosophical question of why does fragmentation exist, I think there's a whole bunch. Some of these are related to incentives, right? So again, journals like new things, and if you have your own paradigm that nobody else's does, by definition, that is new, right? So you don't have to worry about somebody else publishing the same thing. There might also be sort of traditions, right? So if you look at most people and what tasks they use, they're highly related to what they did in their PhD or in their postdoc, because that's the task that they've learned the most. So it sort of continues the fragmentation. So different labs have different tasks, and now everybody else sort of coming out from those labs also has slightly different versions. And it may be, again, sort of practical situations like availability of equipment or space, right? So if I have a particular kind of equipment that I use, I'd like to sort of modify all kinds of questions to fit on that particular equipment rather than try and do different things for different types of questions. So ultimately, I want to say is, if you want to address this model paradigm, the proposal is one thing, but ultimately there also have to be structural incentives, right? So journal policies in terms of what they consider novel or not. Those kinds of things have, also to change. Other sort of, again, practical things like, how do you evaluate somebody who's on a team with 8 other labs as opposed to, publishing with only 2 authors? Again, for a field that's not used to big team science, those kinds of incentives will also have to change, right? If we want to have lots of data, build collaborations across labs, then the work that's performed in those kinds of environments also needs to be recognized. So I'll stop there. I just want to again thank my co-authors who were on the paper. So these were Zhishang Lin, Rakshit Lokesh, Priya Patel, and Amy Tomlinson, and they contributed an enormous lot to many of the ideas that I presented here. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Rajiv. There was a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see the question, if you want to read it, or I can.
Well, maybe if I close my screen again. So reaching adaptation, I think, yes, so reaching adaptation definitely is one common paradigm. But like I said, even when you look at reaching adaptation studies, when we looked at the actual parameters that people use, there is still quite a large degree of heterogeneity. So again, things, for example, do you stop at the target or do you shoot through the target, right? There's different parameters that people use. The angle of rotation, another thing I talked about, do you use 30 degrees or do you use 45 degrees or 15 degrees? All these things seem to change as a function of the lab. Again, presumably, again, I can't sort of fully infer what the authors are thinking about, but even in cases where that manipulation should not matter, they still differ. And so I think reaching adaptation is getting close to that. But for example, reaching adaptation would be an ideal task where it's easier to have a model task paradigm because most labs that already do adaptation have sort of a standard setup, right? So it's not difficult to do it. But I think the thing would be to come up with parameters that are much more standardized in terms of, like I said, number of targets, where the targets are placed, what the rotation is.
If you don't mind, can I push back on that? I mean, as long as, there's 2 sides of it. One, I don't know that it's possible to separate. I don't know what to call it. Changes in the paradigm that's used that are the result of experience and learning by the researchers. So for instance, point-to-point movements in reaching adaptation have largely been replaced by ballistic shooting through movements because people found that just easier to work with and easier to analyze. And how do you, if you've standardized one thing, then all of a sudden you're stuck with something that may be suboptimal. And it's not clear how you balance between those, just as a general principle. But I think the bigger issue, and it's sort of interesting that Lior is the other person with a camera going here, because he's, I've heard him talk a number of times, and he represents a whole group of people, but he says it quite strongly, who feel that reaching adaptation is perhaps overstudied. Right, that the standardization has led to a negative impact on the field, and I find it hard. I don't necessarily, with regard to reaching adaptation, agree with them. Right, like I think that it has power from its standardization, but again, the balance between deciding when something is dominating the field to the detriment of the field and when it's helping focus the field, I just don't understand how you can make any broad generalizations about that, rather than just, figuring that researchers will try to find a community that they can talk to.
Yeah,
right? And that the standardization has to come, in a sense, from below and not from without or from above.
Right. I think I sort of agree with some of the concerns you're raising. So I think, like I said, one of the concerns, maybe I'll address the second point first, because I think it's really important. Again, when I talk about model paradigms here, the goal is not to reduce the total. I think the initial concern was, well, reaching adaptation is sort of being used as a model for all motor learning, right? At the expense of other things that are important. And I think, again, I want to say that's why I don't, I'm not advocating for one model task for all of motor learning, but rather when you're using a particular task, let's say you're using adaptation, or let's say when you're using sequence learning, or let's say you're using some other variation that's, say, variability, for example. The idea would be to have, just like different processes have different model organisms, studying each of these processes in learning would require their own model tasks. So the goal, again, is not to come down to one. I don't think that would be, I think that would be a big concern for myself as well, that if one learning paradigm dominates all of motor learning. But I think to your second point about how do we bounce back and forth if we find that something else works better? I think this is a really important point, and this is where, I don't think of these, excuse me, I don't think of these model tasks as being fixed in all of time, right? So certainly there's certain knowledge that develops, maybe there's certain technology that develops that allows us to do something different than what we used to before. Or maybe there's, somebody finds a big confound in one of the things that needs to be addressed. So I see this as a continuously evolving process. But if we come up with something new, I think the goal would be, again, to have, let's say shooting through works much better than reaching point to point. The goal would be then to have a standard paradigm for shooting through, so that then again, we can compare results across different studies. Again, not just patterns in terms of one group did better than the other or whatever, but in terms of actual numbers, right? What's the actual initial direction error in their study versus mine, where I can actually compare them directly with each other, not just the patterns. I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is regardless of how much we evolve, the goal would be to have some degree of standardization so that we can compare these results.
Thanks, Rajiv. It's very interesting, and I think I agree with the idea that we need multiple tasks, but we need a model task to address certain components like error-based learning, variability, maybe reinforcement learning in motor learning. I'm just curious about like what happened in other fields, because we always think about other fields as more standardized than ours. So like in cognitive psychology, when people are running like the Stroop task or the flanker task, so then the parameters are identical, or they suffer from the same phenomena that in Stroop there are subtle differences, I don't know, in the amount of incongruent versus congruent reaction time. I don't know. I mean,
yeah, I think it's a good question. So I don't know the full answer to that, but I think that, there's still, unless you're using some open source libraries, right? So again, some of these tasks are easier to do because they're run on a computer, as opposed to, motor learning tasks, which usually require some other equipment in addition to a computer. But if you're using, say, standard library of tasks, and then the tasks become identical, right? So I think it's easier in some settings to enforce this standardization. But yeah, I think I haven't done the whole thing of how other studies deal with fragmentation, but I think it's, like I said, if it's open source software that can help you do it on a computer and all you need to do are press keys, then potentially I think it's much easier to do the standardization compared to, say, setting up a reaching adaptation experiment. Although, there are now online experiments to do reaching adaptation and so on. So potentially that might be one way to do it. But yeah, short answer, I don't know the full state of other fields, but I think in general, they at least have the capability of doing it easier than us.
Yeah, from my experience in cognitive psychology things, it's just as bad. I mean, looking at things like Simon Task in this group, where they're all so many different versions, and they also try and reconcile the differences. So I'm not sure that it's any better there. But I wanted to ask you, Rajiv, who do you think should be responsible for doing this process? Because the idea sounds great to me. I just don't know who would be the one who could take this one.
Yeah. So now comes the practical questions, right, where the rubber meets the road, sort of thing. So to me, I think of, basically this requires lots of effort, right? So ideally, this comes from people who are well established in the area. I think leaving it to the people who are new to the field would be an enormous burden, right? Because they have to potentially develop. And again, talk about incentives currently. People are working towards getting tenure at the university or whatever. So sort of put this burden on people who are early on in their career, to me, seems maybe unreasonable to some extent, although they may be the most interested in doing it. So I can see the arguments both ways. But ideally, I'd like to see people who are sort of, using these paradigms a lot, again, coming together. And there was some effort towards that. I know Conrad Corning did this dream database a few years ago, trying to compile all reaching experiments and reaching related experiments into one database. So there's been efforts before to do that. But again, he just sort of, I think their group compiled all the things regardless of what the underlying paradigm was. But that kind of standardization effort at, sort of the people who are much senior in the field, I think would be the ideal way to go, although the buy-in there would be smaller than, say, for people who are starting out. So sort of a trade-off between how much we can reasonably expect them to do versus how much they would be interested in doing. So, I mean, that's a practical question. I don't have a great answer, but ideally, like I said, I'd like the people who are, sort of leaders in the field to coalesce and do it.
Alternatively, you could somehow motivate replications.
Yeah, that's another structural incentive, right? So again, if journals are much happier to accept replications rather than say, this is not novel and reject it, then that would be another big step to doing it. Yeah, and that's why I talked about things like, for example, registered reports, where you get acceptance before you collect data, which is a nice way of publish. At least for these kinds of projects, it might be a nice incentive, because then you don't have to worry about, what if it doesn't turn out to be significant, sort of thing.
Yeah, in a sense, like this fragmentation made us immune to the replication crisis in psychology. That's like,
right.
Which is, I guess, is a problem, because
we don't even know what sort of things don't replicate, because nobody does it.
Right, and then obviously the next problem then is also the analysis techniques, because if for the same study, you can analyze in a million different ways. I know in other fields this has been a big problem. So there was a researcher from Tel Aviv, Tom Schoenberg, that did with an MRI study where they sent the same data to a large number of researchers, and they got a huge number of different responses back for the same experimental data. And I imagine the same thing would happen here, how you decide all the small decisions you have to make along the way.
Yeah, and I think that's why sort of, sharing the data itself, I think, is an important aspect of sort of developing these model paradigms. So again, if somebody comes up with some new technique or something like that, then at least they can potentially reanalyze the data in another way. I think that would be, again, helpful. I think currently the problem is anytime you have an idea, you almost have to run an experiment to test it, right? There's no sort of thing that you can rely on and say, let me see how it works on things that are already out there. I mean, there are very few paradigms where you can do that. And so potentially, again, one goal of this fragmentation idea is, or model task paradigm is, to allow those sorts of things where you could say, what if I, I think, for example, now a big issue is, do you use linear mixed models versus sort of traditional ANOVAs and those kinds of things. And a lot of people say, well, it's sort of the same thing. It doesn't make that big of a difference, but, it would be nice to kind of see it in something that already exists out there. And again, potentially a larger data set so that you can actually see what the big difference is.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rajiv. That was really an interesting talk. A lot of things to think about after the talk, and about the when I'm deciding my next experiment, what paradigm I should use. So yeah, thanks again, and yeah, appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, again, thanks again for having me, and thanks for the questions. Again, if you have more questions, feel free to email me or on Twitter as well. So again, thanks for the discussion. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Rajiv.
All right, thanks, Lior.